Okay, so let's move on to 5.3 conditional maximum. So in this exercise we are given a list of numbers and a threshold value, so a list and a threshold. Then you want to find the largest number that is strictly smaller than the threshold. If no number is smaller than the threshold, your function should return 0. So we see that's what happens in this case, because no number of a is smaller than 0. So that's why it returns 0 in this case. Okay, so let's see how we can approach that. So we should look in the function conditioned maximum. So I'm just going to copy paste this snippet here. Actually, let's just copy paste everything like this. And then I'm going to go to Visual Studio and I'll go back to the files and find this function that I need to implement. There are two here. Okay, interesting. But we are trying to solve this one. So I'm just going to insert an example in the bottom of how we can call it. So here's the list, and then we want to find the conditioned maximum of a and given a threshold value of 3. So print conditioned maximum is this. Okay. So I'm going to solve this using the debugger, because I think this is a place where the debugger can be really helpful. Okay, so what is the debugger? Let's start with that. If I run this code, like let's just see what happens when I press run. It says none. Okay, so what's happening here? What's happening is that when I print run, Python will start by reading the file from the top, so it'll see that there's like a string here that doesn't do anything. Then it'll notice there's a function definition. It'll notice there's a second function definition. Then it'll see that we define a variable here. Then it'll get to the print statement. It'll begin to evaluate what's inside the print statement, so this one goes well. Then it'll get to this part, and at this point it calls our function with a and 3. So we go up. Now Python is inside this function. This list has the numbers that we are given. This threshold value has the value of 3. It starts to execute the function. Since the function literally does nothing, what it'll effectively return will be none. So this expression here evaluates to none, and therefore it prints out the conditioned maximum is none. So that's how Python works. What happens if I run this in the debugger? So now I go up here and I select debug Python file. The same thing. It changes, like it changes this the way the file is called, but you don't need to pay attention to that. You probably didn't pay too much attention to that before. And then actually what the debugger does is exactly the same as regular Python, and that's important. It just reads the file, execute every single line the same way as before, and therefore it ends up printing out the same thing. So why is the debugger smart? Well, if I want to solve an exercise like this, I'm eventually going to get into the problem that I'll get confused about what state my program is in while it's being executed. And what the debugger actually allows me to do is that it allows me to stop the program while it's running. So it allows me to say stop on this line the moment you encounter it the first time, and then let me just see what state you're in right now. Like what state all the variables are in, what state, like what happens if I call a function given the value the variables are in, and so on. So how can I do that? Well, as I showed before, if I press the debugger, it just executes the program as normal. So what I do is that I go into the margin and then I say I want you to stop on this specific line. I want you to stop on line 24 the first time you encounter the line. And now, when I print debug, it starts executing the file exactly as before, and then the moment it gets to this line 24, it stops like this. And it writes this arrow in the margin to say this is where we stopped. And now I can actually open this thing called the debug console, and this is basically just my way of interacting with the Python program in whatever state it happens to be in right now. So what I can do here, for instance, is that I can call this function condition maximum, and I'm just going to call it with a list of some sort and a threshold. As we saw before, this function just returned none, so it's not very interesting. Okay, so what can I do instead? I can insert a new breakpoint, and then I can print. Then maybe now I want the program to continue until it gets to this breakpoint. That's the second thing you need to know how to do. You need to use this play button. So this is like when you press this button, it'll start executing again until it reaches a new breakpoint, or the end of the file, of course. So if I do that, it runs until this new breakpoint. Now it's stopped here, and now I can see what A is by just typing it in here. So now I can just see what happens when what A is. Okay, so this is how we start the debugger, and then the last thing you need to know basically is how you stop the debugger. So you stop the debugger using the stop button. All this other stuff you don't need to think about. Just this one, and this one. So let me remove the breakpoints again. I'm just clicking on them. And then let's go out to this condition maximum. Okay, so what do we want to do here? We want to return the maximum of a list of number that is strictly smaller than the given threshold. Okay, so this description is not very helpful. Let's stick with the one here in the problem. So what is slightly tricky here, in my opinion, is that we need to take into account what happens if no number is smaller than the threshold. So I think my strategy for solving this problem is that I'm going to first create a list containing all the numbers that are less than the threshold. Then I'm going to check if that list is empty. If it's empty, I'm going to return 0. If it's not empty, I'm going to return the largest number of the new list that I've defined. Okay, so I'm going to start by calling this list that I want to define for smaller. And then what I'm going to do is that I guess I need to figure out how to construct the list of all elements that are smaller than numbers. So here's how I can start to do that. I put in a print statement maybe, and then I put in a breakpoint here, and then I enter the debugger by going into the run options and select debug Python file. And now when I do that, Python is going to start running the Python program. It's going to run this line, it's going to run this function, call the function, and now you can actually see that numbers, when I do mouse over, I can see that numbers is equal to this list, threshold is equal to 3, and smaller is the empty list. I can also open the debug console, and then I can see what nums is. I can see what threshold is. Oops, sorry. And I can see what small is. So what should I do here? I need to find the elements in number that are smaller than the threshold. So the natural way to start doing that is to think about a for loop, because it's easy for me to check if any given number is lower than the threshold. So I create a for loop, and I think I call numbers for n. So I loop over all the numbers in this list nums. And maybe I just try to start by just printing out the numbers. Oops, I forgot to write in here. like this. Okay, so I'm in the debugger. Let's suppose that I want to run these two lines and see what they do. What I could do is that I could go into the terminal and then I could write for n in nums. Oops. Yeah, so I actually can't do that. It's not this terminal is good. It's good for single lines. It's not good for multiple lines. If I want to run these two lines, I select them and then I use a shortcut called Shift Alt E. So press select all lines fully and press Shift plus Alt plus E on keyboard. I think on a Mac, the Alt key is called the Command key, but that it's one of the ones. It's either I think it's the Command key on a Mac. I'll just leave it at that. Okay. So what do I mean by this? I mean that I select the two lines, and what I'm doing here is that I'm putting the cursor at this location. Then I'm pressing Shift, and then I'm just using the up and down keys on the keyboard to select the lines. That's a convenient way of selecting a couple of lines. So now I have the lines, then I still hold Shift, I press Alt, and then I press E. And what happens now is that Python runs these two lines inside the terminal and it prints out all the elements of numbers. So these are the elements of this nums variable. Okay, so what do I want to do here? I want to check if any of these numbers are less than my threshold. So I can do that with an if statement. So if it's less than a threshold, I want to say that I should append them to smaller. So maybe I do it the way that I have seen I can append numbers using this kind of construction. So I create a list that just contains n, and then I just concatenate that list with the list smaller. So smaller is this, and n is in this case 5 because the last value n took during the for loop was 5, and that means that when I write smaller plus n, I just get the list 5. So let's see what happens when I run these lines now. Remember that threshold is equal to 3. So I'm going to select all the lines that I want to run. I want to define smaller again. I want to run all of these lines, and then I press Shift Alt E. It doesn't produce any outputs because there's no print statements, but what it did do was that it updated the smaller variable to now be 1 and 2. So basically this allows me to experiment and see how smaller was what happened to smaller when I did my little experiment here. I'm going to just show something else I can do with the debugger. So I'm going to stop the debugger now. Whenever you update the file, it's convenient to stop and restart the debugger because since your file has stopped, you don't really know if the state the program is in right now, that was the state it was in whenever I started running the debugger. It doesn't really correspond to what happens in the code right now, and therefore it's just convenient to restart the program so you know what state your program is in. So what I'm going to do here is that I'm going to insert a couple of other breakpoints because I just want to show you what this for loop is doing using the debugger. So I insert 2 more breakpoints here in the margin. I select debug Python file, go, and now it stops at the first breakpoint, and I can examine what state my program is in. Threshold is 3, nums is this list, and that means that in the first step of the for loop n must be 1. And then I can check if what happens when I press play. Just by thinking a little about it, I'm going to compare n to threshold. Is that going to be true? Well, I'm just copy pasting it here. Yeah, it's going to be true. So that means this line must be executed. In other words, when I press continue, it'll run until it hits the next breakpoint, like the next until it hits a line with a breakpoint. So in that case, it will be this line 14. So if I press continue, I end here at 14. And now I can see what's going to happen. But I'm going to take smaller, which is the empty list, and then I'm going to add to the empty list the singleton list. A list with one element is called a singleton list with just n, and since n was equal to 1, this will be the list with element 1. So now if I press continue, the program is going to run until it reaches until it evaluates a line with a breakpoint. So that would be this line up here. So end up here, and now I can see n is equal to 2 because that is the second element of my non-binary. And again, this is executed. I run again. Now n is equal to 3. The threshold is 3, so this condition will not be true. In other words, when I press continue, it's still going to check this condition. It's going to be false. That means Python will not run this line. This breakpoint will not be triggered, and in fact, it's going to stop again at line 13. But n will no longer be 3. It will in fact be equal to 4 because 4 is the value in this list that comes after 3. We can see that at the very top. So I just press continue, and that is indeed what happens. N is now equal to 4. Threshold is the same value, and this if statement is not triggered. In other words, the variable smaller is no longer being updated. So now what I do is that I just remove the breakpoints, and I press continue, and then it's going to terminate down here, and now I got smaller, like this. Okay. So the next thing I need to do is that I need to check this condition. If no number is smaller than the threshold, your function should return 0. So how can I do that? Well, if no number is smaller than the threshold, then smaller must in fact be the empty list. And I can see in this will not be true in this case, but I can just write the code here. How do I check if it's empty? Like, how do I check if smaller, like let's say we have a list S which is equal to empty list. Well, in that case, the length is 0. So maybe what I can do is that I can check if the length of smaller is equal to 0. It is the empty list, return 0. So in this case, I'm going to return a 0. Otherwise, the function should return the maximum number that's smaller than the threshold. That is the maximum value of this list smaller. So how do I get that? Well, in the previous exercise, we saw that we could do some. Sorry. What is Python doing? Did my IDE crash? I think it crashed. No! Stop! Are we still recording? We're still recording. Okay, good. I think we have a crash here. Yeah, interesting. Alright, so we're just going to pay no attention to this. Oops, something happened. Yep, we want to end it. That was not very smooth. Anyway, back to the regular program. We see that I didn't lose a lot of data. So what I wanted to say before. Okay, let's just start the debug again. So we pick up where we left off. So I just run until I hit the breakpoint, and now I press debug console in order to access the state my program is in. So now smaller has this value. Then what I wanted to say was that in one of the previous exercises we saw that we could actually get the sum of a list using the sum function. Now it turns out that there is something called the min function that returns the minimum value of a list, and there's also a max function that returns the maximum value of a list. So maybe what I can do here is that I can save myself maybe a loop or something else and just use the max function or smaller, and that will give me the element of smaller, which is like the maximum in the case where there is a value of smaller in the case where there is a value of my list that's less than the threshold. Smaller will be all elements of the list that's lower than the threshold, and then max will be the maximum of these numbers that's smaller than the threshold, which is what I want to compute in this case. So now my function is done. I remove all the breakpoints, I stop the debugger, and I can just confirm that this function actually works. So it says 2, and 2 is what it's supposed to do. So let me just really quickly run the tests. Wait, we don't want to run all the project tests, we just want to look at week 5. I go here, I open conditioned max, I guess that's the one, and gives me an error. And that's because I haven't implemented the second of these two functions. But that's going to be in the next video, certainly. These first videos are going a little slower than I expected because we have a lot of new ground to cover.